During the parallel presidential vote and the EU referendum taking place in Moldova, the pro-EU camp triumphed by the slimmest of margins, while the presidential poll went to a second round. Why is the Moldovan vote so important, not only domestically but also internationally? And what are we to expect from the second round of presidential elections on November the 3rd? Joining me now is Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and the author of Goodbye Globalisation. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I would like to begin by taking a look at a quote from Maia Sandu, the sitting president of Moldova. During the counting of the votes on Sunday, she said, I quote, "Moldova has faced an unprecedented assault on our country's freedom and democracy, both today and in recent months." In what sense were the events of last weekend an assault on democracy, and where do we go from here now?
So what Maia Sandu was referring to was the interference that she reported had taken place by a hostile state that she didn't mention, but which is thought to refer to Russia. Really an orchestrated interference campaign in the Moldovan elections that saw people being paid to vote against the referendum proposal for a closer alignment with the European Union, or a pro-EU path. And that is really quite extraordinary. The president was talking about 300,000 votes that were targeted in this way. That's a lot in a small country. And we saw in the election result, in the referendum result, it was extremely narrow, as you said, with a victory for the pro-EU side. But the victory could have been a lot bigger if there hadn't been this election interference. So that's something that is a very serious issue that other countries should pay attention to as well.
Do you think that the tight result could potentially herald a new period of sort of a political instability and protest in the country?
It certainly can, and with any tight election results, you will have people saying, "Well, my vote wasn't counted properly. There has been interference and so forth." In this case, the president obviously said quite clearly there had been interference, but it's always dangerous to have this tight of an election result, even when there is no interference, simply because so many people will doubt the legality of the outcome. And you also have then almost half of the country's population being against the outcome. But I think this goes far beyond Moldova. The fact that there was this election interference and quite blatant election interference involving payments for votes in a particular for a particular choice suggests that the country that was behind it, which again we believe to be Russia, is willing to take this risk, even being identified as engaging in election interference to get the result it wants, or at the very least to cast doubt on the outcome of the election.
I would like to bring some words by Dennis Senusa, who is of the expert group at Germany's University of Gießen, and he recently called Moldova a potential swing state between pro-Russian and pro-European trajectories. What is your opinion on this statement?
Well, this is a swing state that has swung already from a more pro-Russian direction to a more pro-European direction under the current president. And this is why this election was so important. Essentially, the president had asked the country to decide which way do you swing. Do you want to swing the pro-Russian way or a pro-European way, which is why the referendum was crucial. And it's really about the future of the country, which direction they want to go. And this is clearly also why it mattered so much to Russia. Russia is not keen to see Moldova go in a pro-European direction. And it's quite unusual to have referendums on issues this fundamental. In Switzerland, where you have more referendums where those the issues put to people involve much smaller decisions, but this is clearly an existential issue for Moldova, and the president wanted people to decide whether to go with Europe or go with Russia.
As you mentioned in our conversation before, you spoke about Moldova as being a very small country, and those 300,000 votes that could be paid for could potentially swing that result. And as we look at the country, it's around 2.5 million people in total, and it's a relatively small country. What would you say are the specific reasons of why is it so important to Russia and the EU, and why the eyes are currently on Moldova when it comes to these elections?
Well, it's important because so many countries that used to belong to the Russian sphere of influence, both within the Soviet Union and within the Warsaw Pact, so many of those countries have said we want to go in a European direction, and they have indeed, like Poland and other countries, joined not just the EU but NATO. So the number of countries that are keen to side with Russia is quite small, and as a result, every country that entertains the notion or the idea of going in a more pro-European direction is one country too much for Russia, which is why we have seen Russia being so leaning so heavily on Georgia to side with Russia, and now we are seeing Russia again interfere in Moldova. It's not the first time, but this is the first time we have seen such a concerted and really quite open attempt to swing an election outcome in Moldova.
I'm just having a quick look at the results of the referendum. As we've mentioned before, they're far from ideal. Instead of 60% pro-EU target, they reached 50.26%. And Kamil Caus from the Center for Eastern European Studies, he said that this was somewhat a PR failure of the pro-Western cohort in Moldova. Do you think that the results of the referendum could actually predict the results of the second round of the presidential election?
It is fascinating to see these two elections being coupled. They are different. It's one referendum and one election, but yet, because they took place on the same date, involving a president who wants to steer the country in a pro-European direction, and a referendum where people were asked about that direction. It is coupled, and it will be fascinating to see whether people are so frightened by the outcome of the referendum, or so close that they sort of swing behind President Sandu and say we don't want to leave any room for election manipulation by Russia, or by contrast, whether they say, oh, maybe I'll stay home because this is just too difficult, too complicated. It's difficult to know. I think the former will be the case, especially since the majority of Moldovans seems to be behind a pro-European direction to a much larger extent than the referendum result suggested. I think many more will vote for Sandu to make sure that she gets re-elected as president. Mm-hmm.
The situation in Moldova could be potentially a reason for concern. In what ways do you think could Western democracies actually protect democratic processes and assist Moldovan government while maintaining electoral balance?
The most important thing to do in countries that are exposed to interference is to educate the public. And clearly, the European Union should not come to Moldova to educate the public. It's for Moldova itself to educate the public. But one really important issue is to help educate journalists, who are really the pillar of as you know, since you work for a television station yourself, journalists are the pillar of factual information in free and open societies. That's something where we can help Moldovan journalists, Moldovan news outlets do the best possible job they can in a very difficult situation. We can also help train Moldovan officials in the police, in state agencies, and so forth, to make sure Moldova is as robust as possible, as resilient as possible to the interference attempts that will continue to come in its direction.
Mm-hmm. As we look at this dynamic between Russia and Moldova, it still regards Moldova as the near abroad. And we know that Russia keeps hundreds of troops in the breakaway region of Transnistria. Just potentially, if things escalated quickly, could we actually expect Russian military interference?
There has already been Russian military interference in Moldova, and I think we are likely to see it again, probably not at this moment, but if Moldova continues to go in a pro-European direction, Russia is likely to interfere somehow. It doesn't. That wouldn't necessarily involve Russian troops. It could involve paid thugs who are paid to create disorder in Moldova. Russia rarely involves itself in a sort of totally open manner when it engages in interference. So I think we may see more of that, and that is a serious issue for a relatively poor country like Moldova that doesn't have particularly well-equipped institutions. And that's why it also matters so much, if we want to help Moldova, for us to help the Moldovan governments train its officials, and indeed for us to help train members of civil society, journalists, business people, and others.
Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
And so this would be all the latest news for now, but please stay tuned here on TVP World as we will be bringing you more news and features in time to come. Good night.